June 13th, 1944. Normandy, France. The morning air hangs low and wet, pressed into the hedgerows like a held breath. Dew clings to leaves cut and shattered by shell fire. Somewhere beyond the narrow lane, an engine growls, deep, metallic, confident. A German tank rolls forward slowly, its tracks chewing through earth that has already known too much violence. An American infantryman waits behind the hedge. Mud streaks his sleeves. His hands are steady, but his breathing is not. Slung across his shoulder is a long steel tube. Crude, awkward, almost absurd. German soldiers had laughed at it when they first saw captured examples. Too light, too small, a weapon that looked more like a child's toy than an answer to armor. The tank turns its turret, scanning for threats that never announce themselves. Its steel hull has survived artillery, mines, and machine gun fire. It expects the same today. 30 yards. The infantryman steps forward. He raises the tube. There is no thunderous recoil, no heroic roar, just a sharp crack, and a streak of smoke cutting through the damp Norman air. In seconds, the battlefield's balance will change forever. This moment did not begin here. It was years in the making. When the war began in September 1939, the world learned a new meaning of speed and shock. German armored columns did not advance cautiously. They punched forward with confidence, coordination, and terrifying precision. Tanks were no longer just support weapons for infantry. They were the spear itself. Radios crackled inside steel hulls. Engines roared in synchronized motion. Above them, aircraft screamed down to isolate and paralyze defenders. This doctrine had a name, blitzkrieg, and in its early years, it worked. In Poland, then in the Low Countries, and most decisively during the Battle of France, German armor shattered armies that still believed wars would move at the pace of marching men. French fortifications were bypassed. British units were encircled. Entire fronts collapsed, not because soldiers lacked courage, but because they could not stop what rolled toward them. For the infantryman on the ground, a tank was not just a weapon. It was a psychological force. Steel tracks crushed barbed wire and bodies alike. Machine guns swept trenches clean. High explosive shells collapsed buildings into rubble-filled tombs. Rifle fire bounced uselessly off sloped armor. Hand grenades demanded suicidal proximity. Anti-tank rifles, once promising, quickly became obsolete as armor thickened and angles improved. By 1941, this fear traveled east with German armies into the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa. There, tank warfare reached unprecedented scale. Thousands of armored vehicles clashed across open plains. The lesson seemed brutally clear. Modern war belonged to steel, engines, and industrial might. Infantry followed, or crushed. German commanders understood this power deeply. Panzer divisions were elite formations, their crews trained to think aggressively and act independently. Tanks were not expected to fight alone, but when separated from infantry, they were still assumed to dominate any foot soldier unlucky enough to encounter them. This belief hardened into doctrine and arrogance. Across Europe, stories spread among Allied troops. Stories of units overrun in minutes, of machine gun nests flattened without warning, of men frozen in place, firing uselessly as armor advanced through smoke and chaos. In training manuals and whispered conversations alike, one truth emerged. A lone infantryman had no real answer to a tank. The Allies knew this problem well. Early in the war, anti-tank defense relied on heavy guns. 37 millimeters, 47 millimeters, larger pieces dragged into position by crews already under fire. These weapons could stop armor, but only if they were in place, properly sighted, and not immediately destroyed by artillery or air attack. They were defensive tools, not solutions for fast-moving chaos. For soldiers advancing across fields or trapped in villages, they might as well not exist. The British experimented with sticky bombs and improvised explosives, dangerous, unreliable, and terrifying to use. The Soviets relied on mass, sacrifice, and close-range assaults that cost thousands of lives. Germany itself knew the weakness of infantry against armor, but assumed it would always be the one deploying the tanks. The United States, watching from across the Atlantic, absorbed these lessons with growing unease. American planners understood industrial war. They could build tanks. They could build guns. But they also understood geography. Any future conflict in Europe would demand infantry movement through towns, forests, hedgerows, and rubble, places where heavy anti-tank guns could not always follow. What happens, then, when a soldier meets a tank alone? By 1942, this question was no longer theoretical. American forces were entering the war, facing veterans hardened by years of mechanized combat. Confidence in German armor was absolute. Confidence in the infantryman's survival was not. The battlefield had created a brutal imbalance, one that technology, doctrine, and psychology had not yet solved. And somewhere within U.S. Army laboratories and proving grounds, engineers were about to challenge a belief that had dominated Europe for 3 years, that tanks ruled unchallenged wherever they appeared. The search for an answer was about to begin. By late 1941, the United States understood a reality it could no longer ignore. Industrial strength alone would not protect its soldiers. American factories could outproduce almost any enemy. Shipyards launched vessels in weeks. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines by the thousands. Tanks, trucks, artillery. These could be built faster than Germany could destroy them. But none of that mattered to the infantryman staring down a tank from behind a stone wall. The problem was not production. It was proximity. Combat reports arriving in Washington painted a consistent picture. Tanks were rarely destroyed by lone soldiers. When they were, it came at horrifying cost. Men crawling under tracks with explosives, charging forward with mines, or waiting until armor passed before attacking vulnerable rear sections. These were acts of desperation, not doctrine. Within the United States Army, ordnance officers and engineers began asking a dangerous question. Could a single man carry enough destructive power to kill a tank? The idea was not entirely new. As early as World War I, experiments with shaped explosives had shown promise. A shaped charge focused its energy into a narrow jet, capable of penetrating armor far thicker than the explosive itself suggested. The science existed. The challenge was delivering it. Early American concepts were crude. Rifle-launched grenades lacked accuracy and range. Heavy recoilless rifles were too bulky for ordinary infantry. Anything powerful enough to stop armor seemed, by definition, too heavy to carry into combat. Then came a radical compromise. Instead of firing a projectile with massive propellant force, engineers explored rockets, self-propelled warheads that carried their own thrust. This allowed a lightweight launcher, reduced recoil, and the possibility of armor penetration without artillery-scale firepower. On paper, it looked promising. In practice, it looked ridiculous. The launcher was a hollow tube, thin metal, no protective shield. The projectile protruded awkwardly from the front. Early prototypes were unreliable, prone to misfires, and dangerously sensitive. Training manuals warned operators to keep clear of the exhaust blast behind the weapon, a detail that limited its use in enclosed spaces. Many senior officers were unconvinced. Compared to the thick steel barrels of anti-tank guns, the launcher seemed fragile. Compared to the thunder of artillery, it seemed underwhelming. Some dismissed it as a novelty, useful perhaps in emergencies, but not something to be relied upon in serious combat. German intelligence officers who encountered captured examples were even less impressed. Reports filtered back describing the weapon as crude, inaccurate, and underpowered. Tank crews joked about it. Infantry escorts treated it as a minor nuisance at best. But battlefield reality has a way of refining theory. American forces first tested the weapon in North Africa. Against older tanks, it worked sometimes. Against newer models, results were mixed. Range was limited. Accuracy required training. Operators had to expose themselves to fire to use it effectively. There were failures, near misses, and costly lessons. Yet one detail stood out. When the projectile struck at the right angle, it worked. Armor split. Crews bailed out. Tanks burned. The problem was not power. It was doctrine. The U.S. Army began refining training, emphasizing ambush tactics, flanking shots, and teamwork. Infantry were taught to think like hunters rather than targets. The launcher was not a miracle weapon. It was a tool, one that demanded nerve, coordination, and timing. By the spring of 1944, thousands of these launchers crossed the Atlantic with American divisions preparing for the invasion of Western Europe. They were issued widely, often with little fanfare. Some soldiers welcomed them. Others remained skeptical. German commanders, preparing defenses in France, saw no reason to reconsider their assumptions. Tanks had dominated battlefields for years. Infantry-held weapons had not changed that balance in any meaningful way. Normandy, with its narrow lanes, high hedgerows, and close-range engagements, would test every belief held by both sides. What appeared flimsy in training fields would soon be judged under fire. And when theory met steel in the bocage country of France, the results would surprise everyone. The stage was set, not for a single weapon, but for a collision between confidence and adaptation. For the American infantrymen in Normandy, theory ended the moment a tank appeared. There was no safe distance, no protective barrier. The terrain itself worked against him. Hedgerows blocked long sight lines. Villages turned into stone corridors. Tanks emerged suddenly, around bends, through smoke from behind walls that had stood for centuries. To use the launcher, a soldier had to be close, uncomfortably close. 30 yards was ideal, sometimes less. At that range, every sound mattered. The whine of tracks, the clatter of machine gun fire, the metallic thud of rounds striking armor. Infantrymen learned to read tanks like living things. How they turned, how they paused, how crews reacted under fire. Fear was constant, but it was managed, folded inward, sharpened into focus. The launcher was heavy enough to remind its bearer of responsibility, light enough to tempt him forward. One shot, sometimes two, miss, and the tank would respond with overwhelming force. There was no heroism in hesitation, only survival and timing. Teams formed naturally. One man carried the weapon. Another watched for infantry. Others threw smoke or fired rifles to distract the crew. When a shot came, it was fast, deliberate, and final. For the first time in the war, an infantryman could look at a tank and believe, just briefly, that he had a chance. That belief changed behavior. Men stood their ground. Ambushes replaced retreats. Tanks were no longer unstoppable monsters, but dangerous prey. And belief in war is a weapon of its own. The weapon's appearance deceived nearly everyone. It was thin-walled steel, no rifling, no heavy breach. The launcher did not defeat armor through speed or mass, but through physics. At its heart was the shaped charge, a cone-lined explosive that focused energy into a narrow jet of molten metal capable of burning through armor plate. Penetration did not depend on velocity. It depended on geometry. This meant something radical, a lightweight projectile, moving relatively slowly, could punch through steel that once required artillery. Armor thickness mattered less than impact angle. Sloped armor, once a tank's greatest defense, could become a liability if struck correctly. The rocket's limitations were obvious. Range was short. Accuracy dropped sharply beyond a few dozen meters. Early models struggled against thicker frontal armor, but against side and rear plates, the realities of ambush warfare, it was devastating. The Germans had misunderstood the weapon because they judged it by familiar standards. They expected recoil, noise mass. Instead, they faced a system designed for close, brutal encounters where tanks could not maneuver freely. It was not elegant. It was not impressive. It was effective. And effectiveness does not need to look powerful to be powerful. German tank crews entered Normandy with confidence hardened by years of victory. They had survived the Eastern Front. They trusted their armor. Infantry anti-tank weapons had always been a nuisance, rarely a decisive threat. Reports of American rocket launchers were filed away, rarely emphasized. Crews focused on mines, artillery, and air attack, the true killers of tanks. When tanks were lost to infantry weapons, the assumption was operator error or unlucky placement. Few recognized a pattern at first. Fewer still adjusted tactics. Then the losses accumulated. Crews began noticing something unsettling. Tanks hit from hedgerows, from behind buildings, from angles that denied return fire, penetrations that burned through compartments and ignited ammunition. Vehicles abandoned not because they were obliterated, but because they were suddenly unsafe. German doctrine valued armored momentum. Normandy bled it away. The launcher that once seemed laughable began appearing in after-action reports with increasing frequency, not as a curiosity, but as a threat. And as the German army had learned before, underestimating the infantrymen was always a mistake. These perspectives, human, technological, and enemy, did not exist in isolation. They collided in leadership decisions, tactical adaptation, and the brutal environment of Normandy itself. In Normandy, leadership did not look like sweeping maneuvers on a map. It looked like lieutenants crouched in ditches, sergeants shouting over gunfire, and platoon leaders making decisions measured in seconds. The environment erased long-range planning. Hedgerows cut fields into killing zones. Roads funneled armor into predictable paths. Visibility was limited, and surprise belonged to whoever waited longest. Junior American officers learned quickly that tanks could no longer be treated as distant threats. They were immediate, intimate dangers that demanded decentralized solutions. The launcher fit this reality. Officers began assigning anti-tank teams within squads, not as specialists detached from the fight, but as integrated elements. Positions were selected for angles, not distance. Orders emphasized patience. Let the tank commit, let it expose itself, then strike. Doctrine adapted on the ground before it ever appeared in manuals. German leadership, by contrast, struggled. Panzer units were trained for mobility and coordination. In Normandy, they were tied to narrow roads and predictable lanes of advance. Requests for infantry support increased, but Allied artillery and air power made coordination hazardous. What emerged was a leadership gap, not incompetence, but in adaptability. American commanders empowered initiative. German commanders, constrained by terrain and doctrine, reacted. And in modern war, reaction is often too slow. Normandy itself chose sides. The bocage, dense hedgerows grown over centuries, formed natural walls of earth, stone, and vegetation. Tanks could not see through them. Infantry could. Every field became a potential ambush site, every lane a trap. For armor, the hedgerows were suffocating. Turrets could not traverse freely. Speed vanished. Coordination broke down as vehicles lost visual contact with one another. For infantry armed with shoulder-fire rockets, the terrain was ideal. Short engagement ranges neutralized the weapon's limitations. Concealment allowed teams to survive long enough to fire. Retreat routes existed just beyond the hedge. Tanks, once symbols of dominance, became isolated targets, moving through a maze built for their destruction. German engineers attempted adaptations, cutting hedges, modifying tank fronts, but each solution introduced new vulnerabilities. Every adjustment acknowledged a truth they had hoped to avoid. The infantryman was back in the fight. Normandy did not eliminate tanks. It humbled them. Perhaps the most profound change was invisible. Before Normandy, tanks inspired paralysis. After Normandy, they inspired calculation. American infantry no longer scattered at the sound of engines. They observed. They planned. Confidence spread not from propaganda, but from experience. Soldiers saw tanks burn. They saw crews flee. They saw proof that steel could be beaten. German tank crews felt the shift as well. Hatches stayed closed longer. Movements became cautious. Infantry support stayed tighter. Every hedgerow became suspicious. Every village felt hostile. Fear did not disappear. It changed sides. This psychological inversion mattered more than numbers. A weapon that altered behavior reshaped the battlefield. It forced adaptation, hesitation, and doubt where none had existed before. By the summer of 1944, the launcher was no longer a novelty. It was a presence, quiet, waiting unseen until it struck. And all of these forces, leadership, terrain, psychology, were about to converge in the most decisive fighting of the campaign. By mid-June 1944, Normandy had become a battlefield of inches. The initial landings were over, but the fighting had only intensified. Allied forces pushed inland slowly, grinding against German defensive lines anchored in villages, crossroads, and hedgerows. Tanks were everywhere, supporting counterattacks, reinforcing strong points, and attempting to break American advances before they could consolidate. This was not the sweeping armored warfare Germany had mastered elsewhere. It was intimate, confined, relentless. German units, including elements of the Panzer Division, entered the fight with confidence. Their tanks were modern, well-maintained, and crewed by veterans. On paper, they outmatched much of what the Americans could field at close range. What the paper did not show was terrain and men waiting. American infantry began setting deliberate traps. Rocket teams positioned themselves along likely avenues of approach, concealed behind hedgerows or inside shattered buildings. Observers watched for telltale signs: exhaust smoke, track marks, the tremor of engines through the ground. When tanks appeared, riflemen opened fire, not to penetrate armor, but to blind vision blocks and distract crews. Smoke grenades bloomed. German infantry escorts hit the dirt, momentarily separated from their armor. Then the rocket teams moved. Shots were aimed carefully. Side armor, rear plates, turret rings when possible. The range was short enough to guarantee penetration if the angle was right. When hits landed, the effect was immediate. Violent flashes, internal fires, hatches flung open in panic. Tanks that survived often withdrew, damaged, or shaken. Others burned where they stopped, black smoke marking hedgerow lanes that would be avoided from then on. These were not isolated incidents. They repeated across the front. In places like Villers-Bocage, St. Louis outskirts, and the narrow lanes threading the countryside, German armored thrust slowed. Momentum faltered. Tanks waited for infantry. Infantry waited for artillery. Artillery drew airstrikes. The rhythm of German armored warfare, speed, shock, exploitation, collapsed into caution. Reports from American units noted something new. Tanks turning away. Tanks hesitating. Tanks refusing to advance without overwhelming support. For the first time, infantry weapons were shaping armored movement, not merely reacting to it. German commanders took notice, but solutions were limited. Additional armor plates were welded onto hulls. Crews altered formations. Yet every countermeasure added weight, reduced mobility, or introduced new weaknesses. The battlefield was teaching a harsh lesson. What had once been dismissed as a crude, unreliable tool was now forcing one of the most experienced armored forces in the world to adapt under fire. By July, the transformation was undeniable. The balance had not shifted completely, but it was shifting, and with every burned-out tank along a Norman hedgerow, the idea of armored invincibility weakened. The decisive phase was approaching, where recognition would turn into acceptance, and acceptance into irreversible change. By July 1944, the illusion was gone. German armored units no longer treated American infantry-held rocket weapons as curiosities. They treated them as battlefield facts, uncomfortable, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. Reports from across the Battle of Normandy showed the same pattern repeating. Tanks were being stopped not by other tanks, but by men hiding at ground level. This realization came too late to prevent the shift. German crews adapted where they could. Infantry escorts were kept closer, often dangerously close, reducing the tank's ability to maneuver or respond quickly. Tanks advanced more slowly, pausing to fire into hedgerows and buildings before moving forward. Some units welded spare track links and armor plates onto hulls, hoping to blunt shaped charge impacts. But adaptation carried a price. Extra armor added weight. Weight reduced speed. Slower tanks became predictable. Predictable tanks became vulnerable. In the tight lanes of Normandy, every compromise favored the defender waiting in concealment. American infantry units, meanwhile, grew more confident and more disciplined. Rocket launchers were no longer fired impulsively. Crews waited for optimal angles. Teams coordinated fires. Tanks were allowed to pass lead elements so shots could be taken from behind. What began as improvisation hardened into method. The shift was subtle but decisive. During the build-up to Operation Cobra, German armor was expected to counterattack aggressively, smashing through American lines once the initial bombardment lifted. Instead, many armored units hesitated, their movements constrained by fear of unseen infantry teams embedded in the landscape. When tanks did advance, they did so cautiously, often too cautiously. This hesitation mattered. In modern war, seconds decide breakthroughs. Delays allow reinforcements. Caution invites artillery. Artillery invites aircraft. And in Normandy skies, Allied air power was unforgiving. What the rocket launcher ultimately did was not just destroy tanks, it disrupted timing. It forced German armor to fight the battlefield rather than dominate it. Momentum, once the core of German armor doctrine, drained away under constant threat from men who could appear anywhere. German after-action reports increasingly acknowledged infantry-held anti-tank weapons as a serious hazard, especially in close terrain. The tone changed from dismissal to warning, from joke to threat. For American soldiers, the psychological transformation was complete. Tanks were still dangerous, but no longer paralyzing. Infantry advanced knowing they possessed a means, however risky, to fight back. That knowledge altered behavior across entire divisions. By the time Allied forces broke out of Normandy, German armor was already on the defensive, not just strategically, but mentally. The battlefield had rendered its verdict. A weapon once mocked for its simplicity had reshaped how tanks moved, how crews thought, and how infantry fought. The change was not dramatic in a single moment, but cumulative, relentless, and irreversible. And when the hedgerows finally gave way to open country, the consequences of that change followed both armies forward. What remained was to measure the cost and understand what had been altered forever. When the fighting in Normandy began to loosen its grip in late summer 1944, the ground told its own story. Burned-out tanks lined narrow roads and fields. Some were destroyed by air attack or artillery, but many bore smaller, more precise scars, penetrations at the side or rear, scorch marks near engine compartments, evidence of close-range infantry ambushes. These wrecks were not symbols of total defeat, but of disruption. German armored losses in Normandy were heavy, and not all were replaceable. Fuel shortages, air superiority, and constant pressure strained recovery efforts. Tanks that might once have spearheaded counterattacks were now held back, waiting for safer conditions that never fully returned. For American infantry, the change was profound. Units that had once advanced cautiously now moved with calculated aggression. Rocket launchers became standard elements within squads, not special attachments, but expected tools. Training emphasized coordination, patience, and terrain exploitation. Infantry learned to shape the battlefield, forcing armor into spaces where its advantages disappeared. Morale followed success. Confidence spread laterally across units, not through speeches but through observation. Soldiers saw proof that adaptation worked. Fear was replaced with respect, measured, controlled, and actionable. German forces felt the opposite effect. Tank crews remained professional and determined, but the sense of invulnerability was gone. Every advance required preparation. Every pause invited danger. Infantry escorts were stretched thin, forced to guard armor against threats that could appear from any hedge or doorway. The battlefield no longer favored speed. It favored caution. This shift altered engagement outcomes even when tanks survived. Armor that did not advance could not break lines. Counterattacks delayed by hesitation often arrived too late. Opportunities closed. Momentum, once Germany's greatest weapon, slipped away. Normandy did not end German armored warfare, but it redefined its limits. The battlefield consequences were measurable not only in destroyed vehicles, but in slowed advances, aborted attacks, and lost initiative. Infantry had reclaimed relevance against machines designed to dominate them. Yet the full impact of this change would not be confined to France. What emerged from Normandy was a lesson that armies around the world would study carefully. The weapon's influence was only beginning. The implications of the Normandy campaign extended far beyond the fields of France. By the end of 1944, reports from Allied headquarters documented a profound shift in armored warfare. Infantry-held anti-tank weapons, once considered marginal, had forced Germany to rethink doctrine. Tanks could no longer move without infantry support. Crews operated with heightened caution. Every engagement required detailed planning, and the audacity that had defined Panzer operations earlier in the war had diminished. This shift influenced not only immediate tactics, but the design of future weapons. Post-war armies around the globe studied the Normandy experience carefully. The principle was clear: a small, portable, man-operated weapon could neutralize the technological advantage of heavier armor. Shaped charge technology evolved rapidly, influencing anti-tank grenades, recoilless rifles, and guided missile systems. Modern infantry, armed with these tools, became a credible threat to mechanized forces, altering the balance between man and machine. American soldiers carried lessons learned from Normandy into occupation duties, training programs, and later conflicts. The idea that ingenuity, courage, and tactical coordination could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds became ingrained in doctrine. NATO planners in the early Cold War, for example, explicitly accounted for light anti-tank weapons in defensive operations against Soviet armor. German forces, conversely, attempted to mitigate vulnerabilities through technological upgrades, sloped and spaced armor, machine gun-armed infantry, and improved communications. But these measures could not restore the psychological dominance they had once enjoyed. The toy weapon that had been laughed at became a symbol of a new era. In warfare, steel alone no longer guaranteed supremacy. Normandy had demonstrated that adaptability, training, and clever use of terrain could transform the battlefield. What seemed like a minor innovation, a man with a tube and a shaped charge, had shifted doctrine, tactics, and confidence across entire armies. It underscored a fundamental truth of war: the unexpected, when wielded decisively, can overcome the mightiest of machines. As Europe's liberation continued, the presence of portable anti-tank weapons became standard. The lessons of Normandy resonated through military thinking worldwide. Infantry was no longer helpless against armor. Technology and human will together had rebalanced the scales. The stage was set for future conflicts where small, determined forces could challenge even the most formidable mechanized armies. And all of it began in the hedgerows of Normandy, where men and toys turned steel into scrap and reshaped the rules of engagement forever. When the fighting in Normandy began to loosen its grip in late summer 1944, the ground told its own story. Burned-out tanks lined narrow roads and fields. Some were destroyed by air attack or artillery, but many bore smaller, more precise scars, penetrations of the side or rear, scorch marks near engine compartments, evidence of close-range infantry ambushes. These wrecks were not symbols of total defeat, but of disruption. German armored losses in Normandy were heavy, and not all were replaceable. Fuel shortages, air superiority, and constant pressure strained recovery efforts. Tanks that might once have spearheaded counterattacks were now held back, waiting for safer conditions that never fully returned. For American infantry, the change was profound. Units that had once advanced cautiously now moved with calculated aggression. Rocket launchers became standard elements within squads, not special attachments but expected tools. Training emphasized coordination, patience, and terrain exploitation. Infantry learned to shape the battlefield, forcing armor into spaces where its advantages disappeared. Morale followed success. Confidence spread laterally across units, not through speeches but through observation. Soldiers saw proof that adaptation worked. Fear was replaced with respect, measured, controlled, and actionable. German forces felt the opposite effect. Tank crews remained professional and determined, but the sense of invulnerability was gone. Every advance required preparation. Every pause invited danger. Infantry escorts were stretched thin, forced to guard armor against threats that could appear from any hedge or doorway. The battlefield no longer favored speed. It favored caution. This shift altered engagement outcomes even when tanks survived. Armor that did not advance could not break lines. Counterattacks delayed by hesitation often arrived too late. Opportunities closed. Momentum, once Germany's greatest weapon, slipped away. Normandy did not end German armored warfare, but it redefined its limits. The battlefield consequences were measurable not only in destroyed vehicles, but in slowed advances, aborted attacks, and lost initiative. Infantry had reclaimed relevance against machines designed to dominate them. Yet the full impact of this change would not be confined to France. What emerged from Normandy was a lesson that armies around the world would study carefully. The weapon's influence was only beginning. The implications of the Normandy campaign extended far beyond the fields of France. By the end of 1944, reports from Allied headquarters documented a profound shift in armored warfare. Infantry held anti-tank weapons, once considered marginal, had forced Germany to rethink doctrine. Tanks could no longer move without infantry support. Crews operated with heightened caution. Every engagement required detailed planning, and the audacity that had defined Panzer operations earlier in the war had diminished. This shift influenced not only immediate tactics, but the design of future weapons. Post-war armies around the globe studied the Normandy experience carefully. The principle was clear: a small, portable, man-operated weapon could neutralize the technological advantage of heavier armor. Shaped charge technology evolved rapidly, influencing anti-tank grenades, recoilless rifles, and guided missile systems. Modern infantry, armed with these tools, became a credible threat to mechanized forces, altering the balance between man and machine. American soldiers carried lessons learned from Normandy into occupation duties, training programs, and later conflicts. The idea that ingenuity, courage, and tactical coordination could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds became ingrained in doctrine. NATO planners in the early Cold War, for example, explicitly accounted for light anti-tank weapons in defensive operations against Soviet armor. German forces, conversely, attempted to mitigate vulnerabilities through technological upgrades, sloped and spaced armor, machine gun-armed infantry, and improved communications. But these measures could not restore the psychological dominance they had once enjoyed. The toy weapon that had been laughed at became a symbol of a new era. In warfare, steel alone no longer guaranteed supremacy. Normandy had demonstrated that adaptability, training, and clever use of terrain could transform the battlefield. What seemed like a minor innovation, a man with a tube and a shaped charge, had shifted doctrine, tactics, and confidence across entire armies. It underscored a fundamental truth of war. The unexpected, when wielded decisively, can overcome the mightiest of machines. As Europe's liberation continued, the presence of portable anti-tank weapons became standard. The lessons of Normandy resonated through military thinking worldwide. Infantry was no longer helpless against armor. Technology and human will together had rebalanced the scales. The stage was set for future conflicts where small, determined forces could challenge even the most formidable mechanized armies. And all of it began in the hedgerows of Normandy, where men and toys turned steel into scrap and reshaped the rules of engagement forever. War is often measured in tanks, artillery, and territory. Yet sometimes it is decided by something smaller, something overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. In Normandy, that something was a simple weapon in the hands of a determined infantryman. It looked fragile, almost laughable, but it carried the power to rewrite assumptions, disrupt momentum, and challenge the very notion of armored invincibility. The lessons extend beyond machinery. Courage, ingenuity, and adaptation proved as decisive as steel. Men who had faced overwhelming odds discovered that knowledge and preparation could level the battlefield. German crews, once confident, encountered a reality they could not fully control: the quiet, calculated threat of human initiative. This episode reminds us that in war, perception is as important as firepower. Belief shapes action. Fear alters strategy. Confidence, when shaken, can undo even the most formidable forces. Normandy was not won by a single weapon, but by the collision of technology, terrain, psychology, and the human will to survive and prevail. The toy that became a tank killer symbolizes a broader truth. Innovation need not be grand to be transformative. Small tools, wielded with precision and courage, can achieve outsized results. The hedgerows of Normandy, scarred with burned steel, attest to the profound interplay between human resolve and mechanical power. History remembers battles by their scale, but remembers victory by its ingenuity. The American infantryman, armed with what seemed insignificant, taught the world a timeless lesson. Even the mightiest adversary can be challenged, reshaped, and overcome, not just through force, but through daring, adaptation, and the courage to act when others hesitate. Normandy was a crucible, and in its smoke and steel, A toy became legend.